Então, boa tarde. É com grande satisfação que damos as boas-vindas a todos e todas em mais uma palestra da terceira Jornadas de Educação em Ciência e Matemática do PPGF-7. Antes de apresentar a nossa palestrante convidada, eu gostaria de informar que essa palestra vai ser proferida em inglês. Só para contextualizar, a gente fez alguns esforços para providenciar uma pessoa que fizesse a tradução simultânea, mas não obtivemos sucesso. Então, nós gostaríamos de dar aí uma sugestão para quem precisar, né, quem julgar necessário, pode utilizar a ferramenta de tradução simultânea do Google Tradutor, por exemplo, utilizando um dispositivo, como um celular, ligando aí o Google Tradutor, e habilitando a função traduzir por voz, que é um ícone em forma de microfone que fica no canto inferior esquerdo do Google Tradutor. Então, quando habilitar essa função e deixar próximo ao computador ou ao dispositivo que está transmitindo, ele vai captando a voz e vai traduzindo ao lado. Essa é uma opção. Mas também, futuramente, essa palestra será postada, né? A gravação dessa palestra vai ser postada já com legendas em português. Então, vai ser possível qualquer pessoa assistir, né? Acessar futuramente e já assistir com as legendas, né? Durante a palestra, vocês poderão postar perguntas no chat, e essas podem ser em português, né? Podem ser feitas perguntas em português ou em inglês, quem tiver, né? Quem se sentir aí à vontade para fazer a pergunta em inglês. Então, se for feita em português, nós faremos a tradução e passaremos aí a pergunta já traduzida para a palestrante. Terminada a fala, então, dela, né, quando ela terminar a fala, nós vamos apresentar a elas esses questionamentos. Vou apresentar, então, né, a palestrante. Quem vai nos prestigiar aí com essa fala é a doutora Katarin MacLeod. Ela possui graduação em Física pela St. Francis Xavier University. Ela é bacharel em Educação pela mesma instituição. Ela possui mestrado em Física pela Brock University e é PhD em Educação em Ciências pela University of Toronto. A doutora MacLeod está envolvida no sistema educacional canadense há cerca de 20 anos, tem trabalhado com colegas de todo o mundo para desenvolver e promover práticas educacionais que tragam sucesso para alunos e professores. Ela tem uma experiência como professora em sala de aula, lecionou da 5ª à 12ª série de educação básica, né, que é equivalente ao nosso ensino fundamental 2 e ensino médio, especialmente com foco nas áreas de conhecimento relacionadas a ciências e matemática. E atua até hoje, como professora universitária na área de educação, tendo ministrado disciplinas em níveis de graduação e pós-graduação. Ela tem conduzido pesquisas relacionadas à educação STSA, Ciência, Tecnologia, Sociedade e Ambiente, a educação STEM, que é a sigla para Ciência, Tecnologia, Engenharia e Matemática, além de pesquisa em ensino de física e práticas de avaliação. Seu trabalho está disponível em uma ampla variedade de publicações, incluindo o Canadian Journal of Physics, o European Journal of Physics Education, o Journal of Workplace Rights e Physics Education. Atualmente, a doutora MacLeod é professora associada da Faculdade de Educação da St. Francis Xavier University, na cidade de Antigonish, província de Nova Escócia, no leste do Canadá. Desde 2019, a SUNEFEX, essa universidade, tem um acordo de cooperação com o TFPR e alguns trabalhos em conjunto vêm sendo desenvolvidos. Agora, eu vou passar a palavra para a palestrante. So, Dr. MacLeod, I must say that it is a great honor and a great pleasure to have you here with us today, as we are about to close the celebrations for the 10th anniversary of the UTF-PR Graduate Program in Scientific, Educational, and Technological Training. On behalf of the university, my colleagues, and our students, I express our immense gratitude for your willingness to give us this lecture today. Please feel free to start your presentation, and once it's finished, we will open for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rorik. Now, please bear with me while I attempt to put up my presentation. Okay. So, Dr. Rohrig, can you see my first slide?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. To begin, I would like to say thank you and welcome. And I would like to thank both you, Dr. Rohrig, and the organizing committee for inviting me to speak at PPGFCET Science and Mathematics Education Days. I feel very privileged to be asked to speak and to share with you some of the research and the things that we have done here at St. Francis Xavier University. I look forward to sharing this with you and to discussing with you this research and answering questions that you may have. Secondly, I'd like to take this opportunity and thank each of you in the audience for your attendance and spending your time here on Google Meets and engaging in this conference, especially considering that this is a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and spending time with your own professional learning and thinking about how to incorporate STSE education into your own practice as you move forward as educators. So this talk, as you may understand, will be done in English because I speak English. And you will have the opportunity, as Dr. Rohrig said, to use the translation and to be able to have it in Portuguese. If you find that I am speaking too fast, please let the organizers know so that I will speak slower. So this talk I entitled Nurturing STSE Community of Inquiry, How Cohort Learning Can Influence Classroom Practice. And so that's what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. So, to quote Black and William, we shall begin with the end in mind. In the slide, you see a number of pictures. And this is a collection of photos that were taken during our Masters of Education program that focused on STSE, that are focused on the STSE cohort learning. This happened during the pre-pandemic. This for us is what nurturing the STSE community of inquiry looked like during that cohort experience. And for each of these photos, I will explain in a few moments what was going on. Take a moment to look at the photos and to think, is this what my classroom looked like? What's happening in each of these photos? What science is going on? Is this what I would like to see happening in my own science classroom? Now, Dr. Rohrig gave a lovely introduction of who I am and what I have done. And so I thank her for that. And so now I'm going to set up an analogy, because as a teacher, that's one of the things that I do. And I'm going to set up an analogy between who I am as an individual and what STSE is as a concept in science education. And so Dr. Rohrig, when she read the introduction, described to you what my degrees are. And so they're listed there on the slide. And so I have 4 degrees. I share this again with you as an analogy for what STSE stands for: Science, Technology, Society, and Education. It's the very basics. These are my 4 degrees. So, in essence, what can you take away from this? You can take away that I am a physics geek. I have been a physics and math teacher here in Canada and in England. These are my degrees, and that's about all that you can really take from that particular information. It's pretty boring. If we dig a little bit deeper, academically, what have I done? What does this mean? So, these are my research accomplishments. Again, Dr. Rohrig went a little bit deeper in my introduction, and she talked a little bit about the things that I've written and the things that I've done. So, connecting again to the analogy, we could scratch the surface of STSE and think about what could we do in our classroom. And quite often, this is where STSE stops, because we think, STSE is going to be too difficult to incorporate. It's going to cost too much money. It's going to be too much time. So this is where sometimes it just stops. The other point here is that STSE, similar to some of these research accomplishments, starts to branch out. And so when you look at the research accomplishments, it's not all just refereed chapters or journal articles. I've done some other things like workshop presentations or book reviews. Similarly, STSE branches out and starts to look at the nature of science or socio-scientific issues. It's not just a kernel. It's not just a focused piece. And then if you want to learn about the full Katarin MacLeod or Dr. Katarin MacLeod, then this slide provides a bit more from the first 2 about who and what I am as a person. And so on this slide, when you look at it, what you find are a number of pictures that I have collected. And so I will start on the right, and on the top right, you'll see a picture of 3 students, and they have masks on and they have aprons, and it looks like they're in a laboratory setting. And in fact, they were. These are my students from last year during the pandemic, and they were carrying out a lab. Below that picture, you'll notice a familiar face. That's Dr. Rohrig whenever she was here during her visit to St. FX, after she gave one of her talks within the Faculty of Education here at St. FX. The center picture is me while I was teaching one of the courses at an off-campus cohort, and we were doing some PH science. The middle pictures are things like how I enjoy cooking. So that's homemade pasta that I made with my children. It's a picture from Christmas time. And on the far left, you'll see a very large dog. That's Pearl and my husband and my children and our horse. The point here is that there's more to me than my degrees and my research. There's more to STSE than what the 4 letters stand for. STSE has breadth and depth. And the question is, as teachers of science, how do we include STSE in our everyday practice? How do we choose how much or how little of STSE? And by understanding what that breadth and depth can be, just the same as how much do you understand who and what I am as a person, not just what degrees I have, you can better relate to that concept. So this is where I am as a science teacher, a science professor, and a researcher. And so that will help provide you with some context as we dive into this particular research. So where have I been? Because that also helps provide with a little bit more context. So my life has taken me across Canada, from east to west. I'm currently located where the white picture with the X is. That's where St. FX is located. It's on the eastern shore of Canada. And I've been across the country as well as in the far north. And I've also been over to England. And across this country and up north, it's very interesting to see that regardless of the community, many of the problems, the issues that teachers face are the same. In some ways that's comforting, and in some ways it's very sad. So I share that with you. So what does that mean? Where does that put us? What we found here at St. FX and across the country was there's very much a them and us story. And perhaps this is true with you. And in my discussions with Dr. Rory, it seems that way, but I'm curious to hear from you. And so it's a them and us story. So an us meaning teachers, and I put myself into that category. The us says STSE is an add-on. I don't have time for it. I don't have the resources. I don't have the supports. It's expensive. It's hard. I don't know how to do it. But we're required to do it because the government says, the curriculum documents say, but how can I do it? I don't have the time, and the students don't appreciate it, and so on and so forth. And the literature says that this is what the teachers say as well. And then it's the them. So who are them? Typically, from the us point of view, it's the theorists. So it's what's in the literature. And forgive me, but it seems like it's the dusty old people who are the academics, typically in universities. So I guess I'm one of them as well, that say it's in the literature. It's been there for at least the past 60 years. And it's the description of the theoretical frameworks, the philosophical models that go into great detail about how great and wonderful STSE is. But where's the practical application? How, in a 50-minute, 60-minute classroom, can we make this happen when we have no budget and we still have to get through 200 pages of curriculum so that the students can pass their final exam at the end of the year? That's the question. And make it relevant. So, what do you do? Right? I think that's what we want to know. At least that's what the teachers who were coming to us wanted to know. So this was the motivation. And on this slide, it says, this was the motivation to fill the need of practicing science teachers by providing a focused graduate level STSE/science education MEd to the professional community of practice that science educators felt they could access, contribute to, learn with, and from building a community of inquiry. And what that meant to us, so the old people at the university, which I guess I would qualify as, was that we wanted to build a program for the practicing science teachers that would answer these questions and help them build better, more robust programming within the schools so that they were not doing the same old thing year after year, because we knew that the same old thing wasn't working. And so that's what we went out to do. So what did that look like? So at our institution, at St. Francis Xavier University, we have a model for our Masters of Education program. The MEd program we ran as a science cohort. So we had approximately 20 students, and they were to run through a series of courses. It was a 2-year program, and the degree that they took was to be 36 credits. Each course that they took was 3 credits, or a half year long. And the courses, there was a range of courses, and there were some electives, but most of them, to be honest, were mandatory. There were courses in current research in curriculum, in science education. There were specific issues in curriculum development. There was an introduction to educational research. There was an assessment for, of, and as learning course. There was a critical research literacy in education course, and there was a directed study, a capping experience course. And so with these courses, the first course that they were to take, the current research in curriculum, I'm going to spend some time and share what we did in that course. The introduction to educational research is just as it described. It was an introduction to what educational research was all about. It was important for the master's students to have a refresh of assessment for, of, and as learning course, because assessment is an ongoing piece, and there had been many changes to how we assess now compared to how they assessed and learned how to assess whenever they went through the program. The critical research literacy in education course, I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper in this presentation so you have a better sense as to what that looked like. And the capping course, I'm also going to get into detail about. And so with those courses, the point of the courses and the point of the cohort was that we used the idea of the community of inquiry model as a focus for the cohort. But to use the community of inquiry model, we first had to build a community, because these teachers that enrolled in the program came from all over the province, so they didn't necessarily know each other, and some came from outside of the province, so from across the country. And so because they didn't know each other, we had to build community and give them a safe space, because we wanted to get them to rethink their own practice. And so in order to give them a safe space, where they were allowed to learn and think critically about the tasks that they were completing, we had to just allow them opportunities to chat and become friends. So these individuals were transitioning between science teacher and science student continuously. And they had to reflect on their learning and how their learning was changing their thinking of their own classroom teaching. And teachers would engage with each other, and then they would engage with their instructors and any guest speakers that we would have. They would often come back to class and then share with their instructors, whether it be us or whomever was their instructor, conversations that they had had outside of class about the meaning that they were making about what was happening in class. And so that led, of course, then to the community of inquiry model that we see in front of us. So this first course then, I labeled this slide as deconstructing STSE to construct STSE. And perhaps that doesn't make sense, but maybe in a moment it will. So this first course was entitled Current Research and Curriculum, Science Education. So the teachers who had enrolled in this program were fairly traditional in their stance. And we knew that because in order to apply to the program, they had to write a small essay about why they wanted to be a part of the program and what they wanted to change about their own teaching. So we, who had created the program, knew about each one of them before they actually arrived. And so we designed this course with that in mind. And so it critically examined the key strands in science education. So now I'm reading directly from the slide if you're wondering. It examined biology, environmental science, chemistry, physics, geology, and astronomy. So those are the main five elements of our curriculums. And the current and emerging issues such as global warming, STEM, STEAM, and coding. Students would explore in detail the theoretical underpinnings of science education and practical implications of how this research informs current educational practices. This is a field-based course with the majority of the course not being held in a traditional classroom or laboratory setting. So we set up this course. It was a 2-week course. It ran essentially every other day. The second week was a little bit different just due to programming. And it was not lecture-based. They were out in the field. They were doing science. They were not, it was, yeah. To say that it was not lecture-based is about the best way to frame it. And so now I will take you back to the pictures. So these are all pictures from that particular course. And so we felt that it was important to take the science teachers who had signed up for this program and to really refresh their memory of what STSE, what science education could be if they want it to be. And I say science education broadly because in my heart of hearts, it is STSE. So in the top left, that is a momentum experiment and I'm going to get to that in more detail in a few moments. The middle two pictures are an ecology field trip where they went out and looked at dunes and then did essentially a bug collection or an insect collection experiment to look at the health of an ecosystem. The top right picture, they created an interactive poster board with something called a Makey and Scratch, which is a program from MIT. And so use some technology and some grade 5 curriculum to do that. The bottom left is they're doing the straightforward thin lens equation laboratory, where they figure out the formula for a thin lens and then extrapolating that to create their own mini microscope or telescope. The middle picture of the bottom row, they are using probeware to determine the flow rate of a local stream and also how healthy that stream is by then doing a collection of the water and determining what, if you will, bugs or creepy crawlers are in that ecosystem. And then the last picture on the bottom right, they are using, again, Scratch and hummingbirds to create a mini robot. And so the science teachers went through a huge learning curve whereby they went from being very traditionalists into a very different way of looking, feeling, and doing science. And the transformation was incredible within a very short period of time. And so now I would like to zero in specifically on the momentum lab that they did. So this is a relatively straightforward laboratory that one does, at least in most provinces across this country, in grade 11, sometimes in grade 12. It is to calculate one-dimensional momentum. And the idea here is that, the momentum of the initial momentum should equal the final momentum of the system. And it's usually a challenge for your grade 11 or your grade 12 students, depending upon where it's placed in the curriculum. But it's usually quite boring, and it's done in an afternoon. And it's as we would say here in Canada, it's a plug and chug, because students find numbers and they put it into their equation and it has no meaning and they move on. And so what I did back in the early 2000s was I took that lab and I changed it. And the reason that I changed it was because of a news story. And the news story was a very sad story in that there was a death of a child, and the child died because the child was hit in the temple by a BB gun, which in this country is considered a toy. And so I was thinking about that because my own child was very young, and I questioned, well, is a toy really a toy then? And I thought, well, I can't bring a BB gun into a school, but I can bring a water gun into the school. And so I played around and thought, how can I do this? And so that led to reworking the boring one-dimensional water gun or one-dimensional momentum lab into the water gun experiment, and asking students in grade 11 or 12, wherever this lays in your curriculum, is a toy really a toy? And so the science teachers then did the same experiment. And so the point of this experiment is you're given a water gun and you have to find the muzzle velocity. So what is the velocity of the water as it leaves the very end of the gun? So as it just exits the gun, how fast is that water traveling? And you can set up the experiment using an air track, as you see in the pictures, to figure that out. And I wrote it up in physics education, and that was a few years ago in 2007. And it's an STSE lesson. And the point of this is that it's a very doable lab. It can be done in about an hour and a half, 2 hours. If you have air tracks, that's fantastic. If you have Newtonian carts, because that's what you have, that's fantastic. You don't need the fancy equipment, but you just need water guns and a way to figure out what the muzzle velocity is. Now, we help the science teachers develop the contraption to capture the water and to figure out how to figure out the speed and do the calculations. We actually help the science teachers quite a bit with this inquiry-based learning piece. My grade 12 students, I gave them nothing. I said, you're going to figure out the muzzle velocity of these water guns. And I got the students to bring in the water guns. And that was it. That's all I gave them. And they were to figure out the rest. So this is an example of something that's STSE. And then at the end of it, they come up with a number for their muzzle velocity. And then is the critical question. So now that you know what your muzzle velocity is that dangerous? And so then they have to do the critical thinking and figure out, yes, it is, or no, it's not. And decide, is this really a toy? Or maybe it's not a toy. So where do I stand on that? So that was the water gun experiment. So then we moved later on in the degree, and the Masters of Ed students took another course called Critical Research, Literacy, and Education. And so this was getting very close to the end of their degree. And so this particular course, by this time they had taken a number of other courses, and they had a chance to think about and do a lot of different labs and activities and look and think about a variety of different things. And so in this course, students, and I'm going to read from this slide again, students develop their research proposal to investigate a question or problem via action research and support their proposal topic with the appropriate educational literature, and must support their chosen methodological approach and methods with the literature. Proposals are completed individually, and they're typically 20 to 30 pages. Because this is an action research and typically completed within their own classrooms, so the teachers, because they're all teachers, their own classroom with the Regional Center for Education prior approval in place, there was no REB or ethics that needed to be done. However, all protocols must be followed as if the REB was required. So that was the first course in terms of the final bit of their degree. And then once their critical research literacy course was completed, then they moved into their capping course. And I'll read from the slide again. In capping, the students completed the research. They complete the analysis and write up their findings. The capping reports were typically 40 pages. So they took their proposal and added, say, another 15 pages, and had an oral presentation of about 20 minutes. So what were the capping projects that came from this particular group of master's students? So I'm going to share with you what some of the capping projects were. And some of them were really STSE-like, and some of them were very student-centered, but not as STSE-esque, but still really quite interesting. So I'll just share them with you and talk a little bit about each one. So the first was entitled Cooperative Learning as Pedagogy for Cultural Responsive Teaching in Science. So this project was done by a teacher who teaches biology and chemistry in a very small school who has a very culturally diverse group of students. And so her concern about her classrooms is that she wants to make sure that all student voices are heard and that all students feel that they have a place at the science table. And what I mean by that is that as scientists, we sometimes feel or we sometimes project that not everyone, and right or wrong, is capable of doing science for whatever reason. And so she wanted to make sure that everyone in her science classroom felt that they could succeed. And so she wanted to do a project that included a cooperative learning piece so that she could ensure that all of her students, regardless of their cultural background, felt that they were succeeding in the content. And so I bring this to you with the thought of how science and society connect and the point of socio-scientific issues and where do we stand on those pieces. The next, how does the physical setting, traditional indoors or outdoor classroom, impact grade 12 physics students' engagement when problem solving? So for this second project, this was a grade 12 physics teacher, again, very small school, a very poor school, and his students typically would not go to university. Even though this was a grade 12 physics class, his students would end up becoming fishermen. or, yeah, predominantly fishermen, given the community. And so they were taking the course because that was just something that they wanted to do and was offered. And so in order to increase engagement, he was looking for things to do because they were not engaged. So because of the fact that they enjoyed the outdoors generally, he was wondering, if I take my class outside instead of keeping them indoors and lecturing them, would it make a difference? And if I do things with them outdoors instead of keeping them indoors and do more of what we did in that first course, would it increase their productivity and so on? And he found that it did. The third, how to support fellow teachers in implementing technology-related pedagogies as the STEM STSE lead. So this individual, again, another very small school, he was the head science teacher in the small school. He was also the principal at times, so the head of the school. And so this is very much a technology/society piece. How could he increase the technology component and the STSE STEM? He found different ways. His biggest takeaway from this is just to find the time to meet with teachers during the day, because that became the biggest obstacle, just because our days are so full when the students are there. The next on this slide is how hands-on learning with a model-based approach affects grade 7 students' engagement, enjoyment of learning, and understanding of particle theory in the unit on heat. So this was a connection between hands-on learning with a model-based approach for grade 7 students. This particular teacher really embraced the idea that standing in front of students and lecturing, especially at the grade 7 level, so you're looking at age 12, 13-year-old students, does not work. And so doing more of a kinesthetic hands-on is much better. So that brings into the idea of science and technology, and then the engagement, the learning, and keeping that knowledge for longer. So enacting within the brain. So I have 4 more projects to share with you, and then we'll figure out what they all bring together. The next is the efficacy of the flipped classroom. So using flipped classroom to teach aspects of DNA replication. So flipped classroom for us, we spent time within our program explaining to teachers, explaining to this group of teachers what and how to create a flipped classroom, because this was a new concept to this cohort of science teachers. And how we explained it was that you set it up such that the content that you want the students to review comes first, and then the doing is done with you in real time. And so what this particular teacher did, who was a grade 12 biology teacher in an urban setting, was she set up a flipped classroom, and she used the flipped learning for DNA replication so that she had more time in her classroom to focus on the hands-on component. And so it did involve technology. It did involve the doing within the classroom. It involved STSE in terms of what and how is DNA replication important in terms of life and society and just in general. And she also went down the path of, does it work for my students? And does it work for me? And does it actually help the students in terms of, does it result in better grades for them? And she found that by doing a flipped classroom, it did improve their grades. So that was an interesting finding. The second on this slide, cooperative learning in grade 12 chemistry, how to help struggling learners obtain the content, learn social skills, change attitudes, and build learning communities. Similar to one on the previous slide, the idea of building community, learning from each other. Similarly with the culturally relevant, the idea of the importance of building community and the societal piece, and how can we teach students to work together, and the socio-scientific piece. The third, what is the effect of an internal assessment workshop on IB, so International Baccalaureate, students' ability to plan and carry out an original research program for the internal investigation requirement of the International Baccalaureate program? So this was done by an International Baccalaureate biology teacher in an urban setting. And what she found was that her IB biology students were having a very difficult time setting up their research projects. And so to alleviate that, she developed an internal assessment workshop for her students, ran the workshop, and wrote about that for her capping project, and looked at, if I do the workshop, run the workshop, how does that affect their final grades after they submit their projects for the IB program? And she found that by doing that, so this is an assessment piece, by doing that, the students scored better, which makes sense because by understanding what they're looking for, then of course the students have a true sense of where the goals are. So if they understand the structure, then they're going to do better. Now, is that STSE based? That part, no, is not. But the whole essence of the research project and how to structure it and the assessment of it would be. Can incorporating a two-stage testing in summative assessments improve student retention of course knowledge? This, does it fall under STSE? Potentially, no. However, it is a very interesting piece in that what this teacher did, he was a chemistry teacher. He decided to look at two-stage testing. I don't know if you're familiar with this. What it is where you give students two tests. So you give them individual tests, and that's worth a certain amount. And then you do a group test. And the group test is also worth a certain amount. But the group test, the entire group has to participate and contribute to the test. And so it makes everyone accountable when they do the group test. What's interesting is that then you average the two tests together, and that can be their final score. Or you can keep them separate or play around with how you want to play with the grades. You can read in the literature about it. What he found was that by having the two-stage testing, the students who were struggling, after he did two-stage testing, if he did the two-stage testing where he did group first and then individual, it actually improved those that struggled on the individual test, more so than if he flipped it and did individual and then group. I share that with you because pedagogically, of course, as teachers, we're always interested and curious about how to improve. Does it have STSE bearing? You could stretch it, but I'll just leave it there. So where does that come to? Or where does that bring us? Well, from all of this, there is connection between the theory and practice within this particular MEd degree structure. We were moving all the time between this is what the theory says, but this is how do you enact it. Because with this particular group of teachers, talking about the theory was never enough. You had to always, as an instructor within this program, show, demonstrate, do. If you will, we have an expression in English that talk is cheap, and that's exactly what it felt like within this particular cohort. That if you couldn't show it, you couldn't do it, then it wasn't real. And so what were our learnings? Well, the community of inquiry needs to begin with the building of community. If we hadn't taken the time in the beginning to build the relationships between each of the individuals who came to us and to get information from each of the individuals who came to us to find out who they were, what they taught, what their goals were for the program, what they wanted to learn, I don't think it would have been as successful as what it was. The nice thing is that now, so it finished in 2019, we're in 2021. I, as one of their professors, still get emails once in a while from the participants. I know that they are still in communication with each other. They still have their own face group chat, if you will, and they still share resources. To me, that speaks of the fact that they do have a community of inquiry. They do have their own professional learning community. And I know that they have welcomed others into it and they grow. STSE does not have to be a them and an us. It can be a we. There is a way to connect theory and practice, but it's a partnership. It's a dance. It has to be a give and take. It's about perspective. It doesn't have to be an add-on. I see it as a continuum. But that's my perspective. I think STSE provides multiple entry points to the content for all. So in my view, and I think what this research, this this cohort showed is that you can have a little bit of STSE if that's all that you're comfortable with, or you can go all the way and do lots of STSE in your lessons. It depends on what you have available, what you're interested in, and how you want to navigate that. But that was then. That was before pandemic. What do we do now? The world has changed. So last year, when the world shut down, I was here. And I don't know if you are familiar with this. Dr. Rohrig is, because we've been in communication since 2019. St. FX, so St. Francis Xavier, the university that I work for, was one of the few, if not, I think the only university that stayed open during the pandemic. So last year, when everyone went online, I taught face-to-face. And so what I want to share with you is that teaching in pandemic is possible. And what I have learned from teaching in pandemic and from teaching from this MEd cohort is that many things are possible. So if you look at this particular slide, top left, you see that the students are at individual desks, because this was my science classroom first semester. So for me, that was September to November in 2020. No, is that right? I think that's right. Last year. And so what I had to do, because we were to not interact at all, was that every student had to do their own setup. And so I share this with you because as science people, they can still do science, they can still do and experience STSE. It's just that you have to think about the logistics and how you want to do it. And so it is possible. And then when we came back after holidays, so the next picture, so your top right picture, we were allowed then, because our numbers dropped, we were allowed to teach in what's known as pods. So they were allowed to be in groups. And so then still masked, but they were allowed to talk to each other and actually be in groups. And so last winter, well, my winter, so January to March, my science class performed 11 different laboratories, the same as what I would do in any other year, even though we were in pandemic. And so again, I share with you that as science teachers, we can make what seems like the impossible happen. You just need to really think and be creative and plan. The bottom picture is, again, thinking outside the box, and in some cases, getting them outside and doing things in a different way than maybe what you would do traditionally. So here they are outside and they're doing presentations outside instead of being inside. And this was allowed at my university. So I wanted to share that with you because my understanding is that you are not yet back in a face-to-face environment. But when you do, I encourage you to try new things, because humbly, that's what I've had to do. because of the restrictions, life is not the same anymore. And so you find workarounds because you still want to provide good quality education to your students. And so in sum, I feel that to nurture the student, we must nurture our practice. And this can be done through building a community of inquiry and allowing STSE to come into focus within our practice. And so I sincerely thank you all on behalf of both myself and Penelope, our science duck here at St. FX. I thank you, and I will now stop sharing and hopefully be able to see some of you.
Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful experiences with us. I love the science duck. I don't remember.
Oh, she's new.
It's new. It was very nice to remember some moments from the period I spent there with you when we discussed many interesting things. And in this presentation, you told us some things that refers to challenges we have here in Brazil. And it makes us to think a lot about the long road ahead. Well, now we're going to open up to the audience questions, but first I'm going to call Professor Noemi to join us. Noemi. She will help me to organize the debate and translate the answers. I warn you all that this will be quite challenging, but we are going to do our best. Acho que eu vou falar em português agora, né? Nós vamos organizar o debate, né? Eu e a Noemi vamos ler as questões em português e em inglês para a professora Katarin, e vamos tentar, assim que ela responder, tentar não traduzir, mas talvez repassar a resposta em português, né, Noemi? Então, a Noemi, acho que começa com a primeira rodada de perguntas.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Katarin, we're going to make some rounds of questions.
Yeah.
We'll start with a question from Andrea da Silva Castagini Padilha. Dr. MacLeod, could you talk more about how cooperative learning constitutes a pedagogy for a responsive culture in science classes? And how have communities worked on this in their schools, né? Em português. Poderia falar mais sobre como a aprendizagem cooperativa, né, se constitui como uma pedagogia para uma cultura responsiva nas aulas de ciência, né? E como as comunidades trabalharam isso nas escolas. And I could add another question. What are the main challenges to create and maintain this community of inquiry? Okay, anything else?
Okay, I'm thinking. So I'm trying to pick my words correctly. One of the new areas is culturally responsive pedagogy. And the question in Canada, in North America, and I would suggest Brazil, is how do we do that? And how do we do that in science education or in STSE? What does that look like? How are we to be inclusive? And the question comes back to, and this is my opinion, the question I think comes back to, do you know your students? Can you provide your students with a way to connect to the content? So then the question becomes, can you contextualize the content for your student? And I've been talking about the contextualization of content for at least the last 15 years, because I think that to contextualize the content, regardless of the background of the student, is the most important thing. So if I know that I have a student from Nova Scotia, that's going to provide a different context than if I have a student from Northern Canada or a student from Brazil. And I can zoom in on the exact location and the exact background of that student. And so that's where the cultural relevance comes in. So whether I have a student from Nova Scotia who is First Nation, that will change the context of the content. Now, the connection between the cultural relevance and cooperative learning. Cooperative learning deals with how do we, and I'll use us, the three of us here in our group, how do the three of us get along? Because the three of us are from different places. So we come to if we're talking about momentum, we come to that piece of content from a different place. So if we're to do something cooperatively, then as teacher, whoever our teacher happens to be, needs to understand that the three of us come to that content with different views. And if our teacher understands that we come to that content with different views, then the teacher can help each of us navigate those different views. Does that make sense? And it's through that navigation that cooperative learning can be fostered. So it's, in a sense, it's like classroom management that cooperative learning can fall into. And at least that's how I view it. And then culturally relevant pedagogy is, in my view, more of a contextualization piece. Because in my humble opinion, wherever you are from in the world and however you identify, whether you are female, male, trans, white, black, whatever, however you identify, it is about how can I make this content meaningful for you? And that's something as science educators we need to rethink, because when we look, and this is something to think about as we all move forward, when we think about how are we going to get that next grant, right? Because that's the other thing that we have to think about. When we think about how are we going to get that next grant, STSE is not high on the granting list. It kind of is, but it's not. It's about culturally relevant pedagogy, and there are other things that are now becoming socially relevant. And so when and how do we move STSE into these other realms? Because in my view, yes, STSE does incorporate them, but the rest of society does not view it. I don't know, that may have been too long of an answer, so I'm sorry.
It's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's very interesting.
Talvez a gente faça um comentário, né? Ela comentou sobre a contextualização, né? E a relevância da cultura, e me ajude daí, Noemi, se eu perdi alguma coisa, a relevância das questões culturais de cada contexto histórico e social para a definição e até para o trabalho com os conteúdos na educação científica. Então, ela comentou várias coisas interessantes, e essa última eu achei a mais curiosa, né, Noemi? Não sei se você também... que agora essa questão da cultura, né, dessa relevância cultural estar ainda mais, sendo mais solicitada que a educação STSA. Embora a gente compreenda que uma engloba a outra, né, pelo menos eu concordo que o STSA engloba questões de ordem cultural, enfim, mas parece que, e eu acho que eu entendi que ela comentou a questão dos financiamentos para pesquisas também, de grant, né, para pesquisas que envolvem STSA ou que envolvem as questões de relevância cultural. Então, parece que há eles estão passando por um momento aí que também tem aí novas demandas educacionais, né?
E entre essas demandas, né, uma das questões que ela comentou ali no início foi o professor entender, né, que nós temos aí alunos que vêm de diferentes contextos, né, que não é o mesmo contexto, e que isso precisa ser abordado aí na educação em ciências, né, traduzindo já, né, para a nossa forma de falar. Katarin, we made a translation.
Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot about that part.
We summarized some points.
I'll keep it shorter.
Maybe the next questions. Okay. João, are you going to... Okay. This question is from Mayra Scandelari. How have STSE and SSI relationships brought emerging themes to discussion in Canadian learning communities? If you don't get the question, maybe I can explain another way, because sometimes we translate it too fast and the question is a little bit weird. But I think the question is about how the themes, the current themes that are on the top of the discussions in social context, social issues, and under this STSE umbrella, how is it in Canada now?
So what are the themes? So what are the big issues?
Yeah.
So I would say that big issues include, I would say they were the same that you would see in Brazil. and they're the global issues. So things like, global warming. What are we going to do about oil consumption? We have Arctic ice that's melting. Climate change. Fisheries. So it's about larger global pieces. And then we also have much smaller, very local issues. So we have communities very concerned about what's happening in our backyard. And so communities rising up and saying, no, you're not going to clear cut all the trees here, or you have to clean up that stream because that's unacceptable. Like things like that. So it's both large scale and small scale. And that didn't happen 20 years ago. Does that make sense?
Yes. I'll translate and summarize to the participants. Just a minute.
I'm trying to go slow.
Bem, ela comentou, né, que no âmbito aí da educação STSA, né, da abordagem das questões sociocientíficas, conforme a Mayra questionou, há questões comunitárias, né, locais, e também questões de larga escala que foram trazidas, né, para o ambiente educacional, que era algo assim que não necessariamente alguns anos atrás se teria. Silmara, mais alguma questão, né? Algum comentário?
Ela até comentou que algumas questões podem ser bastante similares às nossas, né? Mas a gente sabe que tem algumas que impactam a gente, mas não são similares às que nós temos aqui. Nós temos queimadas de florestas, eles têm gelo derretendo, mas tudo isso, né? Nós temos uma compreensão de que é, de fato, uma coisa muito mais global, mas também as questões mais locais, né? E acho que mais ou menos isso, né? E no final ela comenta que há 20 anos atrás isso não era mesmo uma coisa que era evidenciada na educação científica, agora tem se fortalecido muito lá, né? Acredito que mais ou menos foi isso que ela respondeu. Temos mais um bloco?
Sim, a Regiane Rocha Santana Lopes. Is there a difference between STS education and STEAM education, or are they complementary? Há diferença entre ensino CTS e ensino STEAM, ou são complementares? STS, because in Brazil, some researchers use STS, some STSE.
Yep. So officially, they are different. The STSE is one camp. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math. STEM began in the United States. And then, because STEM has no arts component or no people component, they went, oh, darn, and included the arts. That's why STEM, STEM, this is the short version, became STEAM. And A stands for arts, with arts being very broad. Whereas STSE includes society. Whereas society includes, it can include arts, but it includes all of the societal component. So they are very different. And for us, they are very different. For the general population, they do not see them as being different. And that is where it is up to us as educators to use scientific literacy to educate or to explain what the difference is and why. So we have a lot of work to do.
Ela ressaltou ali algumas diferenças, a questão, inclusive, de artes, né, as questões sociais, aí, que são muito ligadas, né, à educação STSA. Silmara, o que mais?
Eu acredito que uma coisa que eu já tinha ouvido também, né, que essa STEM, agora eu não sei qual que é a diferença entre STEM e STEM quando a gente pronuncia, né? Às vezes sai igual. Ela é de origem americana, estadunidense, e tem sido um pouco até criticada pela ausência da sociedade nessa, e ela comenta, né, a Katarin comenta esse foco na engenharia e na matemática que essa abordagem acaba tendo. Mas acho que basicamente era isso que eu tinha para, né, de complemento, assim. Não... Podemos ir para a próxima. Eu não sei quantas faltam, Noemi, só para a gente ter uma ideia.
Nós teríamos mais essa rodada agora, né? Há algumas questões a mais, acho que a gente pode trazer mais uma questão lá, né, do YouTube mesmo, né, da página do YouTube, e aí alguns comentários gerais para finalizar. Katarin, there are one round more, and maybe another one. There are other questions in YouTube, but I believe 5 rounds will be good. Will be fine.
I'm good.
João Amadeus Pereira Alves. In Canada, do you strongly encourage students to carry out action research in the schools where they will work after completing their courses?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is we hope so, but we don't have any control after they graduate. But we do hope that because that research seed has been planted, that they will continue on and, be curious and try new things, whether it's formally or informally, that they do try.
Então, a pergunta era sobre se no Canadá os estudantes são encorajados a conduzirem pesquisação, é isso, né, Noemi? Acho que Action Research, pesquisação, nas escolas, assim que completam o curso. E ela respondeu, Noemi?
Que espera que sim, né? You hope so, don't you?
A resposta curta
formal ou informal, né? Que eles continuem aí curiosos e trabalhando, né, nessa perspectiva. Ok, just 1 minute. I believe there's one more.
Eu me perdi um pouco aqui, Noemi. Será que o João consegue colocar a próxima que estava na sequência?
João, acho que tem mais uma do professor João Amadeus, e aí tem da Anaí, né? E aí acho que podemos finalizar esse bloco, né? Do professor João, né? João Amadeus Pereira Alves. João is a professor, works with us, with me.
Katarin knows him.
Oh, yeah. In Brazil, there's a great denial of action research or action investigation because the commitment, collective and collaborative work are seen as something very heavy, very difficult. What can you comment about it in Canada?
So we suggest that their action research projects start small. So maybe it's a single change in their course. So for instance, with the two tests, the teacher that wanted to try the two-stage testing, he read about it, and before he dove into his, and you can summarize this, before he dove into that as his action research, he piloted it as a little action research and tried it as just one to see if it was really what he wanted to do. And so as his prof, I said, okay, try it as one. So set it up, see how it runs, try it, test, then group, and then flip the order and see what happens. And then we'll talk about it. So instead of setting it up as a huge research piece with huge data sets and you know how we do research, instead of that, we suggest to the students who are full-time teachers, who typically have families, who typically have 10 other things to do outside of school, do little things. Let's see some success with a little change. Because if they see success with a little change, then they're more likely to do the next step. And from my perspective, I'd rather see a little change with positive outcome than a huge change and no outcome.
A professora Katarin comentou sobre a importância, né, de ir fazendo pequenos passos, desenvolvendo pequenos passos, em vez de pensar em um projeto muito grande. E assim eles conseguem, né, trabalhando, né, família, muitas coisas para fazer e desenvolvendo aí a partir desses pequenos passos e conseguindo resultados positivos com esses pequenos passos, em vez de pensar em projetos muito grandes, né? O que mais que a gente poderia acrescentar, Silmara?
Chama atenção aí a proposta de começar leve, né, que o João justamente coloca que é considerado pesado, e ela comenta que não se utiliza aquela versão da pesquisa que nós costumamos ter, talvez alguns tipos de pesquisa com muitos dados, com muitas informações. Começa pequeno, começa com um pequeno projeto, com uma pequena ação, e conforme essa ação surte os resultados, né, a reflexão sobre ela talvez motiva e causa uma maior... enfim, né, fica mais leve, mais fácil da pessoa, de fato, incorporar isso na prática. Acho que é mais ou menos isso. Qual seria a próxima?
Então, né, faremos mais uma agora, né, e aí depois nós finalizamos, né, acho que conseguimos fazer uma discussão bem interessante. One more, Katarin, and then we'll end the lecture. Okay. I believe we could have a very interesting discussion. Silmara.
From Ana Fazio. What about nurturing inquiring communities online in STSE perspective? Is the experimentation essential in your opinion?
So, in my opinion, the experimental piece morphs or changes when students go online. In that, depending upon the age and what access they have, you can do different things. So, for instance, when they're online, you can have, there are online simulations, so you can do experiments online. You can do simulations online. You can set these things up in an STSE way. You can also set up inquiry-based learning that is STSE framed, whereby you ask the student to conduct the experiment, albeit very basic, at home with things that they should be able to find at home, with parental supervision depending upon the age of the child. That's how I have seen, both as faculty advisor to my B.Ed students and as mother with 2 students in online classes. That's how I have seen it done. Is it, from my opinion, pedagogically the best method? No, but in an emergency remote teaching situation, sometimes that's what we've had to do.
Então, aí alguns comentários, né, sobre as dificuldades aí, né, do ensino online e como desenvolver essas atividades em casa, né, com supervisão, né, e mais que, né, o que foi possível fazer aí nesse período.
Ela comenta o uso dos simuladores, que podem ser utilizados dentro de uma perspectiva STSA, mas as limitações são evidentes, né? Então, como ela né, termina ali, ela não concorda, ela não acha que é o ideal, mas era o que dava para fazer nesse momento de pandemia. Acho que é isso, né, Noemi?
Então, acho que, Silmara, podemos finalizar. Acho que até antes de eu passar para a Silmara, eu vou ler o comentário da Tamara. We can end the lecture now, I believe. Now, to finish, I would like to read some comments from our coordinator, PPGF7 coordinator, Tamara Van Kijk, no? Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Katarin MacLeod. Welcome to PPGF7. The lecture was very good and interesting and provided us with new perspectives on STSE and cooperative learning as pedagogy for culturally responsive teaching. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for this lovely talk and all your the sharing. I think it's a great moment for us, and it was, as I said, an honor to have you here today with us. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend.
Oh, thank you.
It was a very nice Friday afternoon talk.
As you promised. Thank you.
Thank you.